down sources of energy and using them. Your muscle cells literally get better at making energy. This is why when you notice some people, especially when they work out a lot and do a lot of aerobics, it seems as if they could eat more food than you and not gain weight. Well, that's not quite true. They can eat more food, and it does seem like they're not gaining weight. It's not anything special they are doing. It's because their muscle cells are getting more efficient at using their sources of energy. So you'll see that change in cells during endurance training. They become more efficient at using energy. What about strength training? Oh, what about lifting weights? Oh, you see something happen when you lift weights. Think of bodybuilders. They lift weights all day. What happens to them? They get bigger. With strength training, you'll see muscle cells literally get bigger. That's what happens when you lift weights. When you lift weights, your muscles don't get bigger because you get more cells. That does not happen. So if you were to look at someone like Ronnie Coleman or Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the day when they were big guys and compare them to a skinnier individual, those guys didn't have any more muscle cells than the smaller person. It's just that their cells literally got bigger. And we give a name to that. When an organ gets bigger, because the cells making it up get bigger, we call that hypertrophy. 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 That's when an organ gets bigger because the cells making it up gets bigger. And that's what happens to your skeletal muscle during strength training. Your skeletal muscle cells hypertrophy. They get bigger. This is different from something else called hyperplasia. Hyperplasia, Hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is another way an organ could get big. But in hyperplasia, the organ gets big because it increases the number of cells making it up. This is something that occurs in something called BPH. Stands for benign prostatic hyperplasia. It actually told you in the name. This is something that happens in males because males have a prostate and females don't. This is what you see usually in older males. It's simply their prostates get bigger. Spoiler alert, when you get older as a male, your prostate is going to grow. Why? Because the prostate undergoes hyperplasia. The number of cells making it up actually increases when a male gets older. But again, we're sticking with muscles, skeletal muscle cells. When you work out, doing strength training, think lifting weights, you're going to see hypertrophy. The muscles are going to get bigger because the cells are getting bigger. And that's pretty much skeletal muscle. And remember, there are other tissues. There's cardiac and smooth. I'll mention them, but like always, stick to the exam review. Now that we know basic anatomy of muscle cells, thanks to skeletal muscle, we could finally compare it to cardiac and smooth. And next up is cardiac. And like usual, you know things already. And we're going to take some of this skeletal muscle tissue information to help explain cardiac. Don't worry, it'll make sense as we go through it. Just first up, we have to remind ourselves about cardiac muscle tissue. Remember, when you look at cardiac muscle tissue under the microscope, you're going to see those alternating light and dark bands. It has striations. But now you know what really is a striation. You know striations are alternating I and A bands within a sarcomere. So just by noticing that cardiac muscle tissue has striations, you automatically know that if you were to look inside the cells, you're going to find sarcomeres made up of alternating A and I bands, and you're going to find myosin and actin and troponin and tropomyosin. You're going to find your typical muscle cell anatomy, or a very similar muscle cell anatomy, at least when it comes to the striations. But there are other things. Remember, you do not control cardiac muscle tissue, so you don't really have to worry about troponin and tropomyosin the way you do with skeletal muscle tissue. And remember, another major difference is that cardiac muscle cells typically have one nucleus per cell, while we saw that in skeletal muscle cells, they had multiple peripheral nuclei. So that's it. Remember, stick to the exam review. I'm just kind of glossing over cardiac and smooth muscle tissue. Then next up is smooth muscle tissue. Again, we already know it's called smooth because it does not have striations. So now you know something. Because it does not have striations, you know it does not have alternating A and I bands. So it does not have sarcomeres the way that cardiac and skeletal muscle tissue does. So how is this one able to contract? Well, it could still contract because it still has those contractile proteins. And that's what you see on this picture. It still has the thick and thin filaments. It's just that they're not arranged in that unique pattern that we see within a sarcomere. They're kind of scattered in these oblique ranges that you can see in the picture off to the right on their segment C. The blue, thicker looking bands are the thick filaments, and the yellow looking bands are the thin ones. So it still has actin and myosin. It's just not in that pretty arrangement of alternating light and dark areas because there are no sarcomeres. But because it still has the protein, you could still do contractions within smooth muscle. Also, remember, you don't control smooth muscle, so again, you're not concerned with troponin and tropomyosin to that extent. Because there are no sarcomeres, there are also some other structures missing from the smooth muscle. For example, you won't see an extensive sarcoplasmic reticulum the way you did in skeletal muscle, because remember, the sarcoplasmic reticulum was there to store calcium, which you needed to move troponin and tropomyosin out the way. So if you're involuntary, you're not really worried about troponin and tropomyosin. So you're not as worried about having calcium. So you're not going to have it stored in a sarcoplasmic reticulum. So you won't really see that in smooth, and you really won't really see that big of a sarcoplasmic reticulum in cardiac muscle either. So that was just a little brief comparison of skeletal muscle tissue to cardiac and smooth. And again, these last couple slides are just us finishing off muscle tissue. Again, this slide is just us mentioning those definitions we talked about again. When your muscle tissue grows, or when your muscle organ, appears to grow, aka when you're working out as an adult, it's getting bigger via hypertrophy. Why? It's because the cells get bigger. You don't increase in number. Remember, increasing in number is hyperplasia. And muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, don't increase in number. Why? Because they don't really undergo mitosis once you hit adulthood. Remember, mitosis is when cells kind of go through the process of separating DNA and eventually splitting into daughter cells to make more cells. That doesn't occur in adult skeletal muscle tissue. That's why you don't see hyperplasia in skeletal muscle. You don't grow more muscle cells once you hit adulthood. They just simply could either get bigger or smaller based off whether or not you work out. So again, hyperplasia is increasing in size due to increase of number of cells making it up. And hypertrophy is when you get bigger because the cells get bigger as well. Don't worry about smooth muscle and pericytes. And then the last two things we talk about are where do your muscle tissues come from and what happens as you get older. And when it comes to development, just think back to tissues. We know this from tissues. Remember, at one point, you were just made up of 3 major layers. There was endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. Remember, muscle tissue came from mesoderm. And I just want you to know that again. Don't worry about any of this other development of muscle tissue. Just know, or muscles in general. Just know muscle tissue originated from mesoderm, which was just an embryonic type of tissue, which is a tissue before you're born. And then lastly, we talk about what happens when you get older. You know by now it's not good. Things go down the drain. Even your muscles do. How so? Turns out as you get older, you're going to damage muscle tissue. And when you damage it, it's likely to fibrose. Why? Because you're not likely to replace it with other cells. Why? Because you don't do mitosis. Remember, you're going to do hypertrophy, not hyperplasia. So once you damage muscle tissue, it's likely to fibrose and get replaced with connective tissue. Get replaced with collagen, And this is going to happen steadily throughout your life. And by the time you're in your elder years, possibly 70s, up to about 40% of your muscle tissue can be replaced with this type of scar tissue. And this helps to explain stuff. Because you're replacing muscle, which is for movement, with connective tissue, where you're not going to have that much movement. So you're going to see some changes in muscles, the organs, as you get older. What? Where you're going to notice that the muscle strength will decrease. Why? Because there are not that many muscle cells anymore, because they've scarred and